In the forgotten corners of the world, where lanterns flicker against rice paper walls, where offerings rot beneath ancestral altars, and where silence echoes louder than screams, there are stories no one dares to speak aloud. Welcome to folk fear. This is a place where ancient superstitions are not just remembered, they are obeyed, where rural traditions, whispered across centuries, bind the living to the dead, and where the veil between this world and the next is thin, trembling, and red. Here, every tale is rooted in a truth the modern world would rather forget, that rituals were not born of faith, but fear. Fear of spirits, fear of curses, fear of what happens when you break the old rules. Each story we tell is drawn from the veins of cultural memory, ghost weddings, ancestral pacts, Taoist sorcery, blood-bound offerings. You may think they are just myths. You may believe you're safe. But remember this, in places time has left behind, the dead still want what they were promised, and sometimes they come wearing red. So light your incense, close your doors, and do not look behind the mirror, because here we tell the stories that never stayed buried. Welcome to Folk Fear. The road to Xiaoqu was thinner than Ruolan remembered, a narrow, crumbling path, half swallowed by fog and overgrown brush. Trees leaned inward like silent watchers, branches knotted with red paper talismans that flapped in the windless air. Every kilometer felt like a century rolled backward. The phone signal had died hours ago, and with it, the outside world. She hadn't returned in 15 years, not since her mother's funeral, not since the village stopped being home. Now her grandmother was dying, and Ruolan had no one else to call family. The taxi driver refused to go farther than the main bridge, a moss-covered arch that creaked under its own weight. He didn't speak much, but as Ruolan stepped out with her suitcase, he offered her 3 strange words. Ghost month started. Then he drove off without charging her, leaving the dust to settle in the air like ash. The sky above Xiaoqu hung low, as if pressed down by unseen hands. Mist clung to the rooftops like cobwebs, and the houses, old timber framed with gray tiles, looked as if they were exhaling memories. Ruolan walked slowly, following muscle memory more than sight. The village had changed little. The same stone well at the center, still sealed with a heavy wooden lid. The same shrine by the entrance gate, its paint peeled, incense sticks blackened. The same staring silence from behind wooden windows. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the ancestral home that her chest tightened. The Leo residence. Its red wooden door had faded to a dull rust. The stone lions outside had cracks in their faces, like something had tried to pry them open. One was missing its lower jaw. Above the entrance, the family name plaque hung crooked. Liu Jia, flanked by 2 red paper charms, one half torn. Ruolan hesitated. Then the door creaked open before she touched it. Her grandmother was waiting. The woman who had once been iron-willed now sat in a bamboo chair like a shadow of herself, skin pale, cheekbones sharp, eyes sunken with too many sleepless nights. She wore a faded blue kipao and held prayer beads in fingers that trembled with every breath. "Lolu!" she cracked. "You came back!" Ruolan dropped her bags and knelt. "Nai, I came as soon as I could." They embraced, 2 generations separated by distance, secrets, and the heavy air of things unsaid. "You shouldn't have come during Ghost Month," she whispered in her ear. "Things move differently now. The veil is thin." Ruolan did not reply. She had grown up on her grandmother's stories of paper wives, wandering souls, doors that must never be opened at night. She used to believe them. Then she left for the city, and the myths dissolved like morning mist. But now, standing here, surrounded by incense smoke and silence, something old stirred within her, something that hadn't truly died. That night, Ruolan wandered the house alone. Her grandmother had gone to sleep after drinking her bitter herbal tea, eyes fluttering with murmured prayers. The house creaked in a way she didn't remember. The floorboards groaned, not with weight, but as if responding. Walls felt closer than they should have been. Windows refused to open. And everywhere she walked, she smelled sandalwood and something else, something metallic, like dried blood. In the back room, the altar was still lit. Rows of ancestral tablets lined the wall, each name etched in gold, each surrounded by offerings, bowls of rice, old coins, a stick of incense still burning low. Above them all hung a single veil, deep crimson, silk heavy with dust. Ruolan frowned. She didn't remember that veil. It shimmered in the flickering light, almost breathing. She reached for it without thinking. A whisper brushed her ear. "Don't." Ruolan froze, turned. No one. She backed away from the altar and closed the room, heart thudding in her chest. As she made her way to her old bedroom, the hallway light flickered, once, twice. Then the drums began. Soft at first, a dull, distant rhythm. Bodoom, bodoom, bodoom. Wedding drums. But who would be marrying in Xiaoqu during Ghost Month? Ruolan stood at the window and looked out. The street was empty. No lanterns, no people, just a wall of white fog rolling through the trees. And then, through the mist, something moved. A flicker of red. A veil caught on the wind. It drifted across her window like a silk ghost, and then it was gone. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because something inside her had shifted, a strange knowing, as if she hadn't come home at all, but had been called back. By morning, the village had changed, or maybe she had. Villagers nodded but didn't speak. Children stared but said nothing. A group of elders sat near the shrine whispering in a dialect older than she could follow. One of them, a hunched man with only one eye, beckoned her close. "You look just like her," he rasped. "Like who?" she blinked. He didn't answer, just pressed a charm into her hand, a square of paper inked with red, the shape of a woman drawn in symbols. "Burn this before the 7th night." He turned and hobbled away. That evening, her grandmother spoke in her sleep, over and over again. "Red silk, red silk, red silk. Don't take off the veil. The veil sees you. The veil remembers." And then she began to cry. Ruolan held her trembling hand and whispered her name again and again, but the old woman would not wake. And when Ruolan turned to leave the room, there were teeth marks in the mirror, small, precise, human, but they weren't on her face. They were in the reflection. That night the veil returned. It drifted through her dreams like a second skin, wrapping around her throat, filling her mouth with silk, showing her things no child should ever see. A woman in red, screaming behind a locked door. A wedding where the groom had no face. A shrine bleeding from the eyes. A sister begging. Another smiling. And in the distance, always, the drums. Badoom, badoom, badoom. Ruolan woke up gasping. Her throat burned with incense. Her hands bled from where she had clawed her bedsheets. The window was open. The mirror was cracked. And the red veil was folded neatly at the foot of her bed. The veil was warm. That was the first thing Ruolan noticed as she stared at the folded crimson silk resting at the foot of her bed. Not dusty, not stiff with age, but warm, as if it had just been worn, as if someone had placed it there only moments before she woke. She didn't touch it. Instead, she backed away, heart pounding, the dream still bleeding into reality, the sound of the drums echoing in her chest like phantom footsteps. She had locked the windows before sleeping, she was sure of it, but they were open now. The mist curled inward through the wooden slats, cold and damp, creeping toward her like it had intent. Outside, the village was silent. No birds, no wind, no footsteps, just stillness. A pregnant kind of silence. Ruolan reached for her phone. Dead. No signal, no service, no time. The screen wouldn't even light up. Downstairs, the kitchen was dim. The fire in the stove had long gone cold. Her grandmother sat by the window, wide awake, hands gripping her prayer beads so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't speak, didn't even look up when Ruolan greeted her. Just stared out into the fog.
Nai-Nai?
Ruolan said softly. Still nothing. She placed a hand on her shoulder. The old woman flinched, like someone waking from a nightmare she hadn't escaped. You saw it, her grandmother whispered. It wasn't a question. Ruolan nodded slowly. The veil, it was in my dream, and then it was here. A long silence. Then, it's begun again. Ruolan sat in stunned silence as her grandmother finally spoke, not in broken whispers like before, but with the weight of secrets long kept. The red veil comes only when the spirit awakens. It means the contract was never fulfilled. What contract? Her grandmother looked at her then, eyes glassy with age and fear. Do you know why this village has never starved? Why disease never lingers here like in the outer towns? Ruolan shook her head. It's because we made a pact long ago with something older than our gods. The founders of Xiaoqu, they didn't just build homes, they built a shrine, a gate, a cage. For what? The groom. Her grandmother told her of the crimson veil offering, a rite only whispered through generations of women in their family, a secret wedding performed during Ghost Month, not with a living man, but with an ancestral spirit, a protective force, a hungry force. Every generation, one woman from the founding bloodline must be veiled in red silk and offered as a bride, not a symbolic effigy like the ghost marriages the other villagers perform, but a real girl, a real bride. She must wear the veil, recite the vows, bind her blood to the spirit's name, and vanish. In return, the village would be spared. But the last bride, her grandmother's voice cracked. She ran. She was afraid. She tried to escape her fate. Ruolan leaned forward. And they found her? No, her grandmother said, eyes wet. Her sister betrayed her, took her place to protect the family name, to protect me. You mean? Another silence. Then the truth landed like a knife. I was the chosen bride. The crimson veil chose me, but your great aunt, May, she offered herself in my place. She believed it was enough, but the ritual wasn't completed. I wasn't present. The pact wasn't sealed. A tear slid down her grandmother's cheek. So the spirit waited and grew hungry. That afternoon, Ruolan wandered back to the altar room. She wasn't sure why. Curiosity, defiance, fear, maybe all three. The crimson veil was gone. She scanned the tablets on the wall, tracing names she had once memorized during New Year offerings. But something had changed. A new tablet sat among the others, darker, the name carved deeper than the rest. But it was blank. Just a hollow slab of wood, waiting. Ruolan's skin crawled. She stepped back. The air shifted behind her. A whisper, right against her ear. "Do you accept him?" She spun around. No one, but her reflection in the glass of the altar's case. It was still looking at her, even though she had turned away. That night, the mirror began to change. It started subtly. Her reflection lagged by a fraction of a second. Her smile didn't quite match her lips. Her eyes blinked too slow. She tried to ignore it, chalk it up to stress, to the fevered half-reality of this place. But then the mirror bit back. She had just brushed her teeth, looked up, and there they were. Teeth marks, perfect semicircles pressed into the glass, at cheek level, too small to be hers, but sharp, deep. She reached out to touch them, warm. Then her reflection smiled, but she hadn't. She covered the mirror with a cloth. It bled through by morning. Over the next 2 days, the veil returned, always at night, always placed gently somewhere in the room, on her pillow, draped over the lamp, once wrapped around the doorknob like a serpent. Each time it arrived, she had another dream, and each dream was worse. She walked a path lined with red lanterns, but every lantern contained the screaming face. She stood before a mirror that cracked and bled when she looked into it. She saw a wedding, but there was no groom, only the veil. And it whispered her name again and again until it became a chant. Ruolan, Ruolan, Ruolan. You are the promise. You are the debt. On the third night, Ruolan screamed herself awake. She found herself standing in the hallway barefoot, the crimson veil already on her head. She had no memory of putting it on. She tore it off and hurled it to the ground. But when she blinked, it was gone. Downstairs, her grandmother was burning joss sticks furiously, her lips moving in silent prayer. Ruolan broke down. "I'm not her. I'm not the bride. I never agreed to any of this." Her grandmother looked at her, hollow. "You were born into it. You don't choose the veil. The veil chooses you." That night, Ruolan dreamed of a wedding, but this time, she was walking down the aisle, and all the faces in the pews were her own, bleeding. The drums began at dusk. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. Dull thuds that rose from the forest behind the village like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Badum, badum, badum. Ruolan froze as she heard them again. She had tried to tell herself they were dreams, echoes from the old legends her grandmother used to murmur beside incense smoke. But now, in the last light of day, with the mist curling around the rooftops like pale fingers, the sound was real. It throbbed beneath her feet. It pulsed in the walls. It seeped through her skin like cold rain. And no one else seemed to hear it. The villagers moved as if nothing stirred. Children skipped ropes in the square. An old man trimmed faded chrysanthemum blooms. The noodle vendor boiled broth as if the fog hadn't thickened with each passing hour. But Ruolan saw it, in the twitch of an elder's mouth when the drums struck too loud, in the way the priest near the shrine burned extra incense before retreating behind a locked door. Something was coming, and the village was pretending not to see it. That night, her grandmother handed her a bundle of clothes. "Wear white," she said simply. "It's Ghost Festival. The dead are watching." Ruolan unwrapped the garments, linen robes, old-fashioned and too thin for the cold. Beside them, a black sash and a white headband. "Nai, I'm not mourning anyone." Her grandmother looked at her, long and slow. "You are now." The villagers gathered at twilight, forming a slow-moving procession through the old main road. Everyone wore white. Faces were pale beneath flickering lanterns held aloft on bamboo poles wrapped in talisman paper. Ruolan moved near the center, trying to stay close to her grandmother, but the crowd shifted strangely, not hostile, just liquid. Every time she reached out, someone moved between them, and when she looked up, her grandmother was gone. All around her, the drums pounded louder, not from speakers, not from performers, from the trees, from the earth. Badum, badum, badum. The procession came to a halt near the edge of the forest. There stood an altar of red stone, carved into a face she didn't recognize, wide, circular eyes and a long, gaping mouth. Offerings of rice, joss paper, and roasted pork lay piled at its base. Then the elders stepped forward. One by one, they bowed. Not to the altar, but to the forest behind it. A line of red lanterns illuminated the path beyond. They did not sway in the breeze. They hovered, still, silent. And somewhere within that fog-cloaked thicket, a second rhythm joined the drums. Wedding drums, faster now, frenzied. Ruolan's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, paralyzed by the sound. Time unraveled like silk in windless air. But then someone touched her arm. An old woman, blind in one eye, face wrinkled like crushed paper. "You shouldn't be here, child, not when the veil is waking." She stared. The woman continued, voice low and shaking. "They used to use paper brides, you know, effigies, harmless enough. But that spirit, it wanted more. It wanted a bride with breath, with warmth, with a soul." Ruolan whispered, "Why?" The woman's mouth twisted. "Because it was promised one, and promises never die here." The procession turned back after the final offering, but the drums didn't stop. They followed Ruolan home. Every footstep she took, they matched. Every breath she held, they paused. Every window she passed, something was watching. At the ancestral home, her grandmother was waiting. "I saw you in the forest," Ruolan said breathlessly. "Why did you leave me?" Her grandmother didn't answer, just handed her a bowl of water and a pale lotus blossom. "Wash your face. Place this under your pillow. It might keep the veil away tonight." Ruolan took the bowl with trembling hands. "Will it stop the dreams?" "No," her grandmother said softly, "but it may keep them from bleeding into the morning." That night, Ruolan lay in bed with the lotus beneath her head and a blade of fear beneath her skin. The drums never stopped. At some point they grew distant, fading into her bloodstream, into her bones, until they weren't outside anymore. They were inside her. She dreamed again. This time she was the bride, draped in crimson, led through the forest. The trees whispered curses in her ears. The ground bled petals beneath her feet. Shadows knelt in the dark, bowing as she passed. And there, at the altar, a groom waited. Not a man, not a spirit, but something stitched from bones and silk, its face hidden beneath a veil darker than night. He held out his hand. She didn't want to take it, but her fingers moved on their own. As their hands touched, the veil lifted, and beneath it, she saw herself. She woke screaming. The lotus was blackened. The mirror across the room had cracked deeper, a web of fractures forming a shape, a circle, a ring, and in the center, a single crimson smear, like a kiss or a bite. Her grandmother didn't ask questions that morning. She just stared at the blackened flower and whispered something under her breath. "I should have died all those years ago." Ruolan swallowed. "Why didn't you?" Her grandmother met her eyes. "Because your great-aunt loved me too much." A pause. "And because I was a coward." Later that day, Ruolan returned to the forest path. She didn't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or the same pull that calls a moth to flame. Either way, her feet moved before her thoughts did. The altar was still there, but now the offerings were gone. Only the drums remained, and one red veil hanging from a tree branch like a noose. It turned in the breeze and pointed toward her.
The Louis family home had always felt too big for its silence. Ruolan remembered running barefoot through its wooden halls as a child, chasing shadows, hearing her name whispered from behind closed doors. She had thought it was imagination then, echoes from the spirits her grandmother prayed to. But now, with every passing day, the silence inside these walls felt heavier, more deliberate. It was a silence that listened, and something inside the house had begun to stir. That morning, Ruolan awoke to the smell of burnt ash. The incense sticks at the altar had turned to char overnight, all of them, not just the ones she and her grandmother had lit, but even those sealed in drawers, hidden in jars, or buried in storage trunks. Every offering had been consumed, and the mirror by the staircase, the oldest one in the house, had fogged from the inside. But no one had touched it. "Nai, she said quietly. "What happens if a crimson bride is chosen, but refuses?" Her grandmother was silent, peeling a pear with trembling hands. "The veil doesn't accept refusal, only delay, and every delay comes with a price." Ruolan sat across from her, watching the blade tremble as it sliced the fruit. "What price?" Another silence. Then her grandmother looked up. "You'll find it in the name." That afternoon, Ruolan descended into the storage room. It was beneath the west wing, a place sealed off most of the time, hidden behind a thick wooden door bound by iron hooks in a rusted chain. As a child, she had always been forbidden from entering. Today, the door was open. No key, no sound, just open. Inside, the air was different, dry and thick, like it hadn't moved in decades. Dust hung in beams of sunlight like suspended breath. Cobwebs clung to the beams like shrouds. But in the far corner, something glinted. A chest. Small, black lacquered, bound in red thread. Ruolan approached it slowly, feeling each heartbeat like a warning bell. The thread had not rotted with time. It was still taut, still red, still pulsing faintly, as if it remembered fingers tying it shut. She didn't cut it. She untied it carefully, one loop at a time, until the lid lifted with a long, slow sigh. Inside was a bridal box, a crimson comb, a small bronze mirror, a faded silk handkerchief with a name embroidered in gold. Liu Mei, her great-aunt, the one who had taken her grandmother's place. Ruolan's breath caught. She lifted the handkerchief and saw beneath it an old photograph, black and white, grainy. 2 young girls, identical, twins, one smiling, the other looking away. Behind them stood the family altar, shrouded in shadow, but if she looked closely, she could see it, a figure, barely visible, a veil of silk drifting in the corner of the frame, a bride or a ghost. She turned the photo over. Words were scrawled in faded ink. The one who runs brings the curse. The one who replaces it becomes the curse. Beneath it, a second line. One word. Ruolan. Her knees buckled. The photograph slipped from her hand and fluttered to the floor like a dead moth. That handwriting. It was her mother's. Ruolan stumbled backward from the chest. Suddenly the room was darker, colder. She turned to leave and stopped. A shape stood in the doorway. A woman, veiled in red. She did not move, did not breathe, but the veil swayed as if caught in a wind that did not exist. Ruolan blinked. The shape vanished. Upstairs, Ruolan confronted her grandmother. "You told me it was Mei who took your place." Her grandmother nodded slowly. "But why does this say it's me?" Her grandmother looked away. "Because your mother knew the curse would pass." The truth came out in pieces, like bones pulled from the earth. Ruolan's mother knew it. She had grown up hearing the stories, watching her own mother suffer under the weight of unfinished rituals. When Ruolan was born on the first night of Ghost Month, beneath a blood moon, the elders declared it a sign. She had been marked, not just by bloodline, but by fate. Her mother tried to run, left the village, broke all ties, but blood calls to blood, and the veil follows. Always. "You were never meant to be ordinary," her grandmother whispered, tears in her eyes. "You were meant to be the one who ends it, one way or another." Ruolan stood there numb. "I didn't choose this." "No one ever does." That night, the veil returned, but this time it didn't wait at the foot of her bed. It hung from the mirror, spread across it like a spider's web. When Ruolan tried to look away, her reflection didn't move. It stared back, smiling. And then from behind the mirror, behind the glass itself, a whisper crawled through. "Say his name." Ruolan backed away, but her mouth moved on its own. She didn't want to speak it, but it rose from her throat like smoke from fire. Xuan Zhao. The name echoed through the room like a bell toll. The drums answered, louder than ever. And then silence. Thick, final, waiting.
The next morning, the mirror had cracked straight through the middle. The handkerchief with May's name was gone, and on the altar, a new tablet had been placed, etched in red, with Ruolan's name carved into the wood.
The house no longer felt like a home. It breathed now. Ruolan could feel it. The air shifting in her room when no window was open, the creaking floorboards groaning under invisible steps, the way mirrors refused to reflect her fully anymore. They flickered, like the house was deciding which version of her to show. She stopped using them. She stopped asking questions. But something inside her had begun to burn. Not fear, not yet. Something older. I need to know. Her grandmother slept longer now, hours at a time, pale and cold like she was halfway gone. The herbal teas barely touched her lips anymore. Her voice had quieted into broken fragments, sometimes chanting, sometimes weeping, sometimes naming people Ruolan had never met. Xuanzhao, Xuanzhao, you were promised to her. Over and over, like prayer, like guilt. That morning, Ruolan returned to the chest. She didn't want to, but something in her fingers moved before her thoughts did. The red thread had been coiled neatly beside it, as if inviting her to tie it shut again. But she didn't. Instead, she dug deeper and found it. Wrapped in a crumbling linen cloth, stained at the edges, was a small red book. Its cover was silk, once brilliant, now faded to the color of dried blood. The threads binding it were fraying, but intact. There was no title, only a single character embroidered on the front. Ya, meaning bride. Ruolan carried it back to her room and lit a single candle. She didn't know why, but it felt respectful, sacred, or perhaps cursed. She opened the book. The first page held a name in delicate handwriting. Liu Mei, 7th daughter of the founding line. Below it, a single sentence. If you are reading this, then the veil has come again. Ruolan's hands trembled. She turned the page. Day 1. I have been chosen. The crimson veil was delivered this morning by the midwife. My mother kissed my forehead and said I should be proud, that it is an honor, that no girl in our family has ever resisted. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled and bowed. I don't want this. I never wanted this. Day 3. I found Ruolan crying behind the prayer wall. She begged me not to do it. She said I could run, that she would take the blame. But I told her no, that I would be brave. I am lying. Every breath I take feels borrowed. I dream of him now, the groom with no face. Ruolan's breath caught. Ruolan, her grandmother's birth name. She turned the pages faster now, the words unraveling like old stitches torn loose. Day 7. The veil burns when I wear it, not from heat, from inside, like it's soaking into my skin, like it's trying to erase me. When I look in the mirror, I see a smile that is not mine. I no longer know what belongs to me. Day 6. I tried to run. At night, while they slept, I made it to the edge of the forest, but the drums, they called me back. My legs would not move, my voice would not work. Something followed me home.
and it wasn't my shadow. Day 7. Ruolan offered herself. She cut her hand on the family blade and signed the ancestral tablet in my name. I begged her not to do it, but she said this was her debt, that I deserved to live, that she had already seen the end. She put on the veil. She walked into the shrine, and she never came out. Ruolan closed the diary. Her eyes were burning. So it was true. Her grandmother had survived by letting her sister die in her place. But that wasn't the end of the story, because the veil had never stopped looking, and now it had come again. That night, Ruolan placed the diary on her pillow and lit another candle. She sat cross-legged on the floor, watching the flames shiver. And then she spoke aloud. "May, if you're still in this house, I'm listening." The candle flared. The diary opened on its own, and the mirror across the room fogged, words scrawling into the mist from inside. The bride never left. Ruolan stood, heart slamming in her chest. The room turned cold, sharp, and heavy. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and behind her, a breath. Not hers. She turned slowly. The veil was back, hanging from the ceiling like a noose, swaying. She reached for the diary, but it snapped shut. The candle went out, and in the blackness the drums returned. Closer now. Ba-doom, ba-doom, ba-doom. But this time, they weren't outside. They were in the walls. In the hallway, she heard the soft rustle of silk on wood. A bridal procession, but no footsteps, just veils dragging. She backed into the corner of the room and whispered her name over and over like armor. "Ruolan, Ruolan, Ruolan." But it didn't help, because now she knew she wasn't the first. She was just next. Ruolan didn't sleep again. She sat through the night with the crimson diary clutched in her lap. The candle wax hardened into pale rivers down her desk. Outside, the wind moaned softly through the gaps in the wood, like the house itself was trying to breathe. She had read the diary twice now, every page, every warning. And she understood something she hadn't before. The veil wasn't a symbol. It wasn't even just a curse. It was a contract. Her grandmother stirred only after dawn, coughing and mumbling in her sleep. When Ruolan placed a warm cloth against her forehead, she flinched, but didn't wake. Her skin was colder than it had been, her breath shallower. She was fading. Not just from sickness, but from something else, something that pulled at the soul. Later that morning, Ruolan stepped into the family shrine. She hadn't returned since the day she saw her name etched into the blank tablet, but something compelled her now, a gravity deeper than fear. She stepped barefoot onto the old wood floor, the scent of dried incense and old blood clinging to the air. The ancestral tablet stared back at her. Dozens of names, men and women, generations, and at the center, a space once blank, sat her name. Fresh, carved deep. Liu Ruolan. Below it, the red thread was tied in a tight knot, the same knot used in Taoist blood-binding rituals. She reached for it, but the moment her fingers grazed the edge of the tablet, the room shifted. The walls groaned, the lanterns flickered, and the shrine door slammed shut behind her. The room grew cold, breath frost cold. A low hum rose from the altar, like a chant but without words, a vibration that rumbled in the bones. The red curtain behind the ancestral altar began to move, swaying softly, and then she heard it, a voice, not spoken aloud, but inside her head. Blood remembers. Another voice joined it. The pact was broken. Now the debt must be sealed. Ruolan stumbled backward. "No, I didn't agree to anything. I didn't make any pact." But the voices continued, layered, overlapping, masculine and feminine, old and young. "The pact is older than you. It was written in your bones before you were born." The red curtain behind the altar fell open. Behind it was a mural, one she had never seen before. It was painted directly onto the stone wall, faded with time but unmistakably clear. A woman in red kneeling before a faceless groom. The groom wore a robe of black and gold, his hands made of bone, his mouth a void. And above them, in an archaic script, were 5 characters. Yi She Wei Li, Yi Ming Wei Zheng. By blood, the offering. By death, the seal. Ruolan stepped closer. The bride's face in the painting. It looked like hers. The air thickened, the floor beneath her trembled, and suddenly her grandmother's voice broke through the haze, clear, ragged, from the hallway outside the shrine. "Don't touch the wall!" Ruolan turned. The door had opened. Her grandmother stood in the doorway, pale as paper, gripping the frame to stay upright. "That mural, it's the gate, the last veil. You touch it and the spirit comes through." Ruolan's heart pounded. "You knew about this. You knew everything." Her grandmother nodded weakly. "I didn't want you to suffer what I did, what May did." "Then why didn't you burn it, destroy it?" "Because you can't destroy a vow carved into the bone of the village." They sat in silence for a long while. Ruolan stared at the tablets, her name, the veil, the mural. Her grandmother stared at the floor as if she couldn't bear to look anywhere else. Then slowly, the old woman began to speak of the ancestral pact. Long ago, when Xiaoqu was founded, the land was cursed, crops failed, infants died in the womb, madness spread like smoke through the rice fields. The villagers believed they had disturbed something sacred, something old. A Taoist priest was summoned from the mountains. He came bearing one solution: a marriage, not between 2 people, but between the living and the dead. A spirit had claimed the valley. It demanded loyalty, it demanded worship, but most of all, it demanded a bride. One who would not flee, one who would give herself willingly. In return, the land would flourish, the sickness would end. So a pact was made. The founding family would offer 1 daughter each generation. A veil would be dyed with oxblood and hung each ghost festival. When the spirit accepted the bride, the village would be spared. If not, the veil would return, and the village would bleed. Ruolan said nothing. Her fingers trembled in her lap. "So you offered May instead?" Her grandmother wept silently. "I was chosen, but I was afraid. May, she believed in the pact. She thought she could end it. She thought if she obeyed, the spirit would be satisfied forever." Ruolan swallowed hard. And was it? Her grandmother looked up. "No." That night, Ruolan dreamed again. This time, she stood at the altar in the mural. not the painted one, the real one. Cold stone beneath her feet, red petals falling from a sky without stars. The veil was in her hands, heavy, wet, breathing. The groom stood before her, faceless, formless. He reached out and whispered, "Say yes and end the hunger." Ruolan dropped the veil. "No!" The world split in two, and she woke up choking on silk. The veil was wrapped around her neck, tight, alive. She tore at it with both hands, gasping for air. Only when she bit into the fabric did it release, slithering from her throat like a serpent, disappearing beneath the floorboards. She lay there sobbing, her lungs clawing for air. In the mirror, her reflection smiled, and behind it, May stood, veiled and bleeding, whispering, "You have 7 nights left." The veil had always waited in silence, but now it was waking, and it had begun to move on its own. The first sign came in the form of breath, not her own, but warm air, steady and rhythmic, brushing against Ruolan's cheek each night as she tried to sleep. When she opened her eyes, there was never anyone there, only the red veil, folded neatly beside her pillow, always freshly pressed, always waiting. On the second day, the mirrors turned. It began with the bathroom mirror. She stepped inside to wash her face, and her reflection didn't follow. It stared at her from a moment earlier, face still, unmoving, as she reached for the water. Then it blinked, slowly, deliberately, after she had turned away. It had begun to lag. That night, her reflection smiled when she didn't, and behind it, another figure appeared, a bride, veiled, silent, watching. The villagers no longer looked her in the eye. When she walked through the square, they averted their gazes. Mothers pulled children aside. Elders bowed their heads as she passed, not out of respect, but out of fear. She was becoming marked, claimed. Only the priest by the entrance shrine dared speak to her. He lit 3 incense sticks and whispered without looking up. Once the veil chooses, nothing can unchoose it. Then he handed her a pouch of black salt. Place it around your bed. It may buy you time. But his voice trembled as he said it, as if even he didn't believe in mercy anymore. That evening, her grandmother stopped speaking. Her lips moved, but no words came out, only shapes, silent prayers to ancestors who could no longer hear. She stared blankly at the altar wall, as if she were already part of it. Ruolan held her hand, feeling the chill settle deeper in her bones. "Nai, what happens if I run?" Her grandmother didn't answer, but her hand, frail as it was, closed tightly around Ruolan's fingers, and from her throat came one cracked word. "Worth." Ruolan began to dream in pieces, fragmented rituals, whispers under the floorboards, teeth being sewn into fabric, a ring of girls kneeling in red, their eyes hollowed out and filled with rice, and always the veil, sometimes worn by her, sometimes chasing her. Once it crawled from her own mouth. On the 3rd night, she woke to the sound of breathing inside the walls. Not rats, not pipes. Breathing, slow, measured, close. She pressed her ear to the wood. The breath paused, then something knocked back from the other side. The black salt she poured in a circle around her bed was disturbed by mourning, not scattered, but shifted, in the shape of a ring, a wedding ring. Her body began to change, not all at once, but subtly. Each day her reflection showed something off, a tilt of the head that wasn't hers, lips thinner, eyes darker, hair beginning to lose its color at the edges, a thread of red showing at her roots that wasn't there before. Her hands, once steady, now trembled with every touch of the veil. And still, she kept finding it, in drawers, on doorknobs, folded into her clean laundry, once wrapped around the family blade like a gift. On the 5th day, she screamed, not from fear, but because her mouth had begun to say things she didn't understand, ancient words, a dialect no longer spoken. She caught herself humming a wedding song, one her grandmother said hadn't been sung since before the war. The villagers began their own rituals. She saw it in the offerings piled outside her gate, talisman strips nailed to her doorframe, bowls of rice marked with black ink, a caged rooster left on her porch with its feet tied, still alive, but silent. They were not trying to protect her. They were trying to seal her in. That night, the veil spoke, not in words, but in breath against her ear. It kissed her cheek as she slept. She woke to find the blanket tucked around her, hands folded neatly on her chest, like a bride laid in a coffin. And on her bedside table, a single red tooth. The drums grew louder, always closer. She stopped leaving the house, not because she was afraid of what was outside, but because something inside her had begun to ache when she stepped into sunlight. Her eyes watered, her skin tightened. She felt like she was being peeled. The house was becoming her body, and she was no longer sure where her skin ended and the wood began. Her grandmother died on the 6th day, or maybe not, because when Ruolan found her in bed, eyes open, mouth closed, stiff as wax, she wasn't cold, she was warm, too warm, and she was smiling. The village held no funeral, no bells, no mourning clothes. They brought incense and left quietly. Ruolan sat alone beside the body, too numb to cry, until she looked at the wall. A new tablet had been placed, her grandmother's name, but the ink was red, not black. That wasn't for the dead. That was for the offered. Ruolan collapsed that night, in front of the mural, the painted altar, the groom's empty face, and the bride now visibly pregnant. The mural had changed, and this time the bride wasn't her grandmother. It was Ruolan, painted in strokes of fresh crimson. She screamed. She beat the wall with her fists. The house echoed with her rage. And when she collapsed, the veil fell gently over her shoulders as if to comfort her, as if it was saying, "It's almost time." The veil no longer waited in silence. It had begun to whisper. The words came softly at first, like wind through hollow wood. 7 nights remain. Ruolan heard it as she brushed her hair, as she poured tea, as she blinked too long at her reflection. Always the same voice, neither male nor female, not old, not young, but familiar, like it was made from the tones of her own bloodline, the breath of every ancestor who had once stood in this house and obeyed. 7 nights, until you remember who you are. On the first night, the red veil wove itself into her dreams again. This time, she stood in a rice field beneath a black sun. Hundreds of brides knelt beside her, all veiled, all silent, their faces bleeding through silk. In front of them, the spirit groom waited, a man-shaped shadow made from drifting ash wrapped in golden prayer strips. He opened his arms, and they all began to crawl toward him, weeping, chanting her name. Ruolan, Ruolan, Ruolan. She woke with dirt under her nails. On the second night, the house changed. She opened the door to her childhood bedroom and found it filled with water, not metaphorically, literally, a room-sized pool, still, reflective. At the center floated a wedding comb, snapped in half. She stepped back and shut the door. When she opened it again, the water was gone, the floor dry, but the broken comb lay at her feet, and her reflection in the hallway mirror now had blackened eyes. On the third night, her grandmother's body had disappeared, not buried, not stolen, vanished. Only the veil remained, draped gently over the bed, glowing faintly in the dark. And on the pillow, a hairpin, blood-tipped, ancient, her family crest engraved into the silver. She recognized it. It had once belonged to Liu Mei. The diary had new pages now, pages Ruolan never remembered seeing before, each written in her own handwriting. Day 3. The spirit entered me tonight, not fully, just enough to leave a seed. My skin itches, my dreams bleed, my voice is changing. I sang the wedding song in my sleep. I don't know how I knew the words. Day 4. The mural is growing. I thought it was paint. It's not. It's flesh. I touched it. It breathed. Day 5. The villagers are watching, waiting. They've seen this before. They know what's coming. I am becoming the thing they fear and need. Ruolan topped the book. The ink was still wet. On the fourth night, her body betrayed her. She found herself standing at the altar in the shrine without remembering how she got there. The candlelight danced on the walls, casting silhouettes not her own. The mural had grown, the painted bride now wept red from her eyes, and the groom had grown claws. Her name was now carved into the mural itself, bleeding at the edges. Ruolan screamed and backed away, but the stone beneath her feet pulsed like a heartbeat, and she realized the altar was not a place, it was a mouth, and it had begun to open. On the fifth night, the veil spoke again, not through whispers, but through her own mouth. She stood before the mirror and watched her lips move, but the voice was not hers. I am the seventh. I am the seal. I am the bride who did not run. Behind her, in the mirror, Liu Mei stood, veil lifted, eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut with thread. But still she was smiling, as if proud, as if waiting. On the sixth night, Ruolan tried to run. She packed a bag, slipped out through the garden gate, took the path through the fields, and made it 20 steps. That's when the fog came, thick, red, alive. It wrapped around her ankles, her waist, her throat. And then the veil dropped from the sky, covering her face, suffocating her scream. When she awoke, she was in bed, clean, dressed, wearing the veil. The 7th night arrived like a funeral procession. No drums, no birds, just silence. Even the village itself seemed to hold its breath. Ruolan lit every candle in the house, burned every talisman, covered every mirror. And still, the veil hung from the ceiling like a noose made of silk. The mural's painted bride now smiled. The groom's hands were reaching out of the wall, and the altar had begun to whisper her name. That night, she heard footsteps outside her room, slow, deliberate, barefoot on wood. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the blood-stained hairpin in her fist. The doorknob turned. Once, twice, stopped. Then the door opened, and Ruolan's mother stood there. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. Real, but not alive. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dry, and from her mouth silk spilled like smoke. "You were born for this," she said, voice hollow. "You tried to run, you cannot." She stepped forward and pressed something into Ruolan's hand, a bridal ring, old, engraved. Ruolan tried to scream, but the veil slid across her face before she could. And the last thing she heard before everything went dark was the sound of wedding drums. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. Ruolan awoke in the dark, but it wasn't the ordinary dark of night. It was ceremonial, heavy, the kind of darkness that knew her name. The veil lay folded over her chest like a shroud. Its silk was damp, not with water, but with something thicker, almost warm. When she sat up, it slithered off her body like it had been breathing with her. Her hands were stained red, the bed sheets too, and the window, though closed, was weeping blood. Outside, the village was still, too still. She stumbled to her feet, legs unsteady, the floor beneath her bare feet cold as bone. The air smelled of burnt incense, decayed flowers, and salt, the scent of shrines, of offerings, of grief. She moved through the hallway like a spirit herself, each step echoing as if the house were hollowing itself around her. When she reached the altar, she found the mural had changed again. The groom was now fully painted, no longer faceless. His head was crowned in broken bone, his hands stretched wide, palms turned upward in invitation. But the bride was missing, vanished from the wall entirely. And across the altar stone, someone had written in what looked like fresh blood, "One must choose to die or choose to become the curse." Her grandmother's voice whispered in her mind, "The one who runs brings the curse. The one who replaces it becomes the curse." She had thought it was metaphor. It wasn't. It was lineage. It was fate. Back in the family storage room, Ruolan clawed through the old chests, ripping through dust-drenched linens and rotting wooden boxes, until she found a stack of bound family records, red-threaded birth scrolls hidden beneath rotted offerings. The Liu bloodline. She scanned page after page, names, dates, blessings written in black calligraphy. until she reached her own, and then it hit her like ice water poured into her lungs. Her name had been written in red. Only one other name had been marked that way: Liu Mei, the Crimson Bride. She flipped back to earlier generations. Every red name belonged to a daughter. Everyone died or disappeared before age 30. Everyone was listed as married to the ancestor. And then she found something worse. A letter, written by her mother, tucked between the folds of her own birth scroll. To my daughter Ruolan, forgive me. I tried to break the chain. I left Xiaoqu so you would never know your name was written in red. I thought if you grew away from the shrine, the veil would forget you. But it doesn't forget. It waits. It always waits. Your name was whispered the day you were born. The priest carved it into the altar before I could stop him. The elders said it was the only way to protect the harvest. I told them I would return when the time came, but I never did. Now it wants you, because I ran, because my mother ran, because we all tried to sever the thread, and all we did was tangle it tighter. If you read this, know that the veil has awakened, and it won't rest until one of us dies in red. Ruolan sat on the floor, surrounded by the names of her ancestors, her face buried in her hands. It wasn't just a curse, it was inheritance. It wasn't a haunting, it was a marriage contract passed down like a dowry, and she was the last daughter in the bloodline. There was no one else left to take her place. That night, she returned to the mural, and the bride had returned, but now she was painting herself, brush in hand, crimson strokes staining the wall like blood spatter. She watched in horror as the painted version of her turned slowly and smiled. Then the mural split open, not figuratively, literally. The wall cracked down the center, revealing a staircase, narrow and winding, descending into black earth. The scent of decay billowed out, along with the soft beat of wedding drums, slower now, like a tired heartbeat. She should have run, but something inside her whispered, "Finish it, or bury the village in red." She lit a lantern and descended, step by step, into the earth, into the womb of the house, into the place where the pact was born. The chamber was a tomb, stone walls painted with dozens of veiled brides, all identical, all nameless. At the center stood an altar made of ash and bone, its surface carved with binding scripts in Taoist ink. Dried blood pooled in the grooves, and in the middle sat a bridal sash, soaked in red. Above it, hanging from the rafters, was a noose made of hair. Real hair, still braided, still fresh. She heard her grandmother's voice again. Not a memory, a presence. I didn't just let May go, I sent her. I told her if she took the veil, it would end with her. But it never ends. It only changes hands. Ruolan collapsed to her knees and whispered into the dark. Then I won't pass it on. I'll be the last. And as she spoke the words, the veil unfurled above her, slowly, reverently, and lowered itself over her head. And the spirits around her began to weep. Hundreds of brides, silent, watching, betrayed. The altar pulsed, the drums roared, and the groom finally stepped forward from the dark, a being made of shadow and gold, his mouth sewn shut with red string. He held out a ring made of bone and waited. Ruolan stared at it and said, "Not yet." Then she turned and ran, up the stairs, out of the shrine, into the night. the veil still on her face, but now she was the one haunting the village.
The veil didn't come off. Not when Ruolan pulled, not when she screamed, not when she clawed at her own face until blood pooled beneath her fingernails. It had become part of her, a second skin, a silken tomb. She ran through Xiaoqu with the crimson veil fluttering behind her, bare feet slapping against ancient stones, breath tearing from her lungs like paper burning at the edges. The village was asleep, yet every window watched her. Behind every shutter, a hidden eye. Behind every door, a held breath. And still, the drums followed, soft now, patient. Badum, badum, badum. Like the heartbeat of something that didn't need to chase her, because it knew she would return. They all returned. She collapsed at the stone well in the village center, the same well that had been sealed for generations. As a child, she had thrown pebbles into it, waiting to hear the splash that never came. Now she pressed her palms to its moss-covered lid, and the stones beneath her hands were warm, breathing. She leaned closer, and from the depths below a voice rose up, slow and ancient and dry as death. Bride of my blood, womb of my covenant, why do you run when you were already chosen? Ruolan screamed and backed away. The lid began to tremble. Cracks formed in the stone, and from beneath it, red silk began to rise. The veil again, in another form, always returning, always multiplying. She ran, and the fog ran with her. She didn't stop until she reached the old shrine on the mountain's edge, a place so forgotten it wasn't marked on any map. Overgrown with vines, roof half collapsed, steps crumbling. It was the one place she hadn't dared to enter as a child. Now she knew why. Because this was where the groom had been bound. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Scrolls littered the ground, bones in corners, ash-covered altars that hadn't seen incense in decades. And at the center, carved into the floor, was a massive binding circle, etched deep with blood-inked Taoist scripts and symbols of marriage. At its center, a stone coffin, unopened, chained with red string and rusted iron. She approached slowly. Each step dragged her deeper into the silence, until her foot brushed something soft, a paper bride, collapsed on the floor, humanoid, faceless, arms folded across its chest in eternal obedience. Ruolan looked closer. It wore a sash. Her name was written on it, in red ink, fresh. The coffin groaned. Chains snapped one by one, and the lid began to rise. She wanted to run, but her legs locked in place. Her body did not belong to her anymore. The veil had claimed her limbs, her breath, her will. All she could do was watch as the spirit groom rose from the coffin. He was not what she expected, not monstrous, not grotesque. He was beautiful and wrong, too tall, too still, cloaked in robes that moved like smoke, embroidered with gold prayer symbols that shimmered and wept blood. His face was hidden beneath a mask of bone, carved with teeth and eyes that didn't blink. And beneath the mask, something throbbed, something ancient, alive. He stepped over the circle without disturbing it. The scripts flared and burned to ash. And then he bowed to her, a perfect groom, waiting, obeying, demanding. Ruolan backed away. "You don't own me," she whispered through the veil.
but her voice came out as his. "I do not need to own what was given. You were promised before your first breath." She tried to scream, but her throat burned. Her body dropped to its knees, and the spirit groom stepped forward, placing his hand over her heart. "I have waited through generations. They fled, they lied, they forgot, but you remember." He pressed something cold into her palm, a red jade ring carved into the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail. Eternal, irrevocable. He whispered one last thing. "The wedding begins at midnight." Then he vanished, leaving only the ring and the sound of drums returning, louder, heavier, now pulsing from inside her ears. She stumbled out of the shrine, back into the mist-covered world, clutching the ring, the veil soaking into her skin, the voice of the spirit echoing in her blood. When she passed the village gate, the priest was waiting. He did not flinch when he saw her, only bowed deeply and said, "Bride of the ancestor, the village welcomes you." Then he handed her a sealed scroll. Ruolan unrolled it with shaking hands. It was a wedding contract. Her name was written in red, and beside it, Liu Xiaoqu, the spirit groom's name, the same name carved in the original altar, the same name whispered in every dream, the same name that should have never been spoken aloud. Ruolan collapsed in the garden of the Liu estate. The ring slipped onto her finger without resistance. The veil tightened around her face, not like fabric, but like a second layer of skin. She tried to rip it off, but her reflection in the window stopped her, because it was smiling, and it whispered, "You are the bride," and the curse made flesh.
There were no invitations, no music, no celebration, only silence. The kind of silence that waits behind closed doors, that listens from behind mirrors, that grows teeth in the dark. The wedding had begun, and the entire village knew. Ruolan stood at the heart of the Liu estate, veiled in crimson, ring on her finger, lips sealed by unseen force. Her eyes burned behind the silk, not with tears, but with the heat of inevitability. The spirit was no longer whispering. He didn't need to. She felt him in every breath, every pulse, every cell. He was inside her now. Not a possession, but a presence, a groom who had waited too long to be refused. Outside, the villagers moved like shadows, placing paper lanterns at every doorway, tying red silk to tree branches, scattering rice in spirals along the path from the family shrine to the ancestral altar. But none dared look at her. They walked with heads bowed, hands trembling. Their faces told the truth. This was not a celebration. This was a sacrifice in disguise. Ruolan tried to speak, but her voice was gone. She tried to remove the veil, but her fingers passed through it as though it had become smoke, or memory, or blood. The world around her had grown thinner, less real, as though she were stepping out of life and into ritual. At midnight, the drums began. Not from the village square, not from the forest, but from beneath the ground. Budum, budum, budum. A heartbeat, a summons, a demand. The doors of the ancestral shrine opened without touch. Inside, the altar glowed with red flame, not fire, but light that pulsed like veins. The mural on the back wall had disappeared, replaced by a massive red curtain drawn tight across the stone, hiding whatever lay beyond. Ruolan stepped inside, barefoot. Behind her, no one followed. This part of the ritual was not meant for the living. Candles lit themselves as she walked. The shadows bowed. The ancestral tablets hummed. Her name, Liu Ruolan, had been etched into each one, over and over again, as though her soul had been scattered through time, as though she had always been the bride. She reached the altar, and the curtain parted. Behind it stood the spirit groom. His robes were woven from funeral paper and red thread. His mask was gone, revealing a face carved from thousands of names, each one stitched into his skin like calligraphy, weeping ink and memory. His eyes were deep black wells filled with starlight and smoke. And when he extended his hand, Ruolan's body moved without permission. She stepped forward and took it. The altar split open beneath them, revealing a spiral staircase of bone and stone. She descended, hand in hand with death, veil fluttering behind her like a flag of surrender. Down, down, deeper into the earth than she thought possible, until they emerged into a chamber lit by floating lanterns made from human teeth. This was the wedding hall, and the guests were already waiting. Rows and rows of veiled brides, unmoving, breathless, dead but not gone, each one bound in crimson, each one watching, each one waiting for Ruolan to join them. At the center of the room stood the blood altar, carved from the remains of the first offering, soaked in centuries of obedience. Upon it sat a scroll, the final vow. Ruolan stepped forward. She tried to resist, but her hands obeyed the rhythm of the drums. She picked up the bone-carved brush. She dipped it in red ink. She signed her name. The room sighed. The lanterns spun. The brides wept blood from beneath their veils, and the spirit groom pressed his forehead to hers. His breath was like dust and longing, his voice a blade. Now you are mine. The veil melted into her skin. The altar consumed the scroll, and Ruolan's body went cold. For a moment she thought it was over, that she would die now, fade, disappear, become one of the silent brides who came before. But instead, she began to change. The spirit groom stepped back and bowed to her, because now she was not just his bride. She was the new veil, the next spirit, the keeper of the curse. Ruolan screamed inside her own mind, but the silence outside swallowed it whole. Above ground, the villagers lit fireworks, not in joy, but in warning. The sky filled with red sparks, not to celebrate the marriage, but to appease it, to mark that the veil had claimed another, that Xiaoqu was safe, for now. And in the shrine, where time had stopped, Ruolan stood frozen before the altar, no longer breathing, no longer blinking, but not dead, not entirely, just veiled, waiting for the next bride. For a moment, the village believed it was over. The altar sealed, the veil satisfied, the drums gone, the offering made. But that belief was a lie. Because this curse never ended, it only slept, and Ruolan had not vanished. She was still there, still beneath, still watching,
still becoming. Above ground, the villagers resumed their rituals. A feast was prepared, not for joy, but for debt. Lanterns were lit at every doorway to honor the wedding. Ghost money was burned in great piles to send gifts to the spirit groom. But no one spoke her name aloud, not even once. To say it would be to call her back. Ruolan drifted in silence beneath the shrine. Her thoughts no longer felt like her own. Memories looped, not just hers, but echoes from every bride who came before. She could feel May's despair, her mother's terror, the numb surrender of women whose names had been buried with their bones. Each of them had stood at the altar. Each of them had signed the scroll. Each of them had become part of the veil. Ruolan was not alone, but she was the only one awake. She reached for her face. There was no face. Only silk, only red, only layers. She peeled, once, twice, but more veil replaced what was removed. It grew from her skin like fungus, like breath, like obligation. The drums were gone, but something worse had taken their place. A voice, not outside, inside, the groom, speaking from her bones. One more offering must be made. She didn't understand. She had signed. She had bowed. She had become the bride. Wasn't that enough? And then she remembered. The ritual had never been completed. Not truly. Because she did not go willingly. She resisted, fought, tried to escape. And the pact, as ancient and cruel as it was, demanded something more. A bride who walked forward, not one who was dragged. The curse would not be satisfied by a reluctant soul. It needed faith. It needed love. The spirit groom appeared again, not as before, not as a towering shape of shadow and bone, but as a man, plain, soft-eyed, wearing her father's face. He knelt beside her in the chamber of brides and held out his hand. "Come, let us try again." Ruolan stared at him, and this time she smiled, because now she understood. This was not just a haunting, it was a loop, a trap, a system built to harvest obedience, to strip lineage from women and call it protection. She stood slowly, every movement sending ripples through the red silk that now covered her like a gown, and she whispered, "You don't want a bride. You want a jailer. You want someone to wear your chains for you." The groom blinked. "You were chosen." "No," she cut him off. "I was bred for this." She reached into her veil, pulled free the hairpin of Liu Mei, still sharp, still soaked in ancestral blood, and plunged it into her palm. Her blood hit the altar like fire. The chamber screamed, the brides wailed, the walls cracked, and the groom recoiled, smoke hissing from his skin. Ruolan screamed into the chamber, "I give you a final offering, not myself, but the truth." She raised her bleeding hand, let the drops fall onto the altar, onto every name carved into the stone. "This curse ends with me." The veil caught fire, but it did not burn her. It peeled away from her skin like ash from flame, falling, fluttering, writhing. The room filled with wind, with voices, with resistance. The brides began to rise, one by one, lifting their heads, tearing their veils free, screaming names that had been stolen from them. "I was Lin Hua. I was Su Yin. I was Jio. I was Mei. Ruolan's voice joined them. I am Ruolan, not a bride, not a vessel, not a silence. I am the end of your name. The altar cracked in half. The spirit groom screamed, his face melting, names burning off his skin one by one. The scrolls burst into flame. The chamber began to collapse. But Ruolan stood still, watching, smiling. As the ceiling caved in, the last thing she saw was the mural, now empty. No bride, no groom. Just a door and light beyond it. She walked through.
Ruolan walked through the door. Not a physical one, not wood or stone, but something older, made from breath and memory, sewn from silk threads soaked in ancestral blood, a veil between worlds, torn open by her defiance. The moment she stepped through, everything changed. She was no longer underground, no longer in Xiaoqu, no longer anywhere the living would recognize. The world beyond the ritual chamber was a twilight plain, a liminal place where time unraveled like thread, where sky and soil held no color, only muted echoes of red and gray. Trees with no roots hung upside down, mountains floated sideways. Lanterns drifted through the air with no fire, no string, just soft light that remembered sorrow. And in the center of it all stood a mirror, 10 feet tall, made of polished obsidian and bleeding. Ruolan approached, slowly, barefoot. The ground beneath her feet felt like breath, rising and falling. As she neared the mirror, the reflection sharpened. Not of her face, but of every bride before her, layered like pages in a book. Mei, her mother, the ones who had no names. They stared back at her, not in accusation, but in hope, in trust, in release. And behind them stood the groom, no longer cloaked in gold or shadow, but naked, alone, thin, and afraid. His voice trembled. "Please, don't leave me." Ruolan stared through the mirror. She saw it now. He had never been a god, never a demon, just a spirit that had once been offered too much and became addicted to obedience. He wasn't power, he was hunger. She stepped forward and whispered, "You cannot take what is no longer yours." She pressed her blood-stained palm to the mirror's surface, and it shattered. The world screamed, the sky split, the lanterns extinguished, the brides vanished in bursts of light. The groom fell to his knees, crying red, the names on his skin peeling, flying into the air like ashes caught in a typhoon. And Ruolan burned, but not in pain, in freedom. Her veil turned to wind, her ring turned to salt, her name carved in every altar, every tablet, every cursed scroll melted from memory. And for the first time since her birth, she could breathe without a shadow pressing on her chest. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying in a field, back in Xiaoqu. The sun was rising, real sun. Birds sang, children laughed in the distance. No drums, no fog, no silence, just morning. She stood slowly. The veil was gone, the ring gone, the red from her hands vanished. She looked around and felt something strange. Peace. For the first time. She walked through the village barefoot and unafraid. And the villagers? They didn't look away anymore. They didn't bow. They watched her in awe. Some whispered prayers. Some wept. But none stopped her. Because they all knew. The bride had returned. But she was no longer the offering. She was now the keeper of the truth. Back at the Liu residence, she found the family altar cracked, the mural gone, the shrine clean, the tablets restored, but without her name. Only one offering remained, a red comb and a white lily. No veil, no chains, no pact. She buried the comb beneath the old magnolia tree in the courtyard, and as she covered it with earth, a voice whispered through the leaves, "Thank you." She didn't know if it was May, or her mother, or someone far older. It didn't matter. She had ended it. But curses don't vanish, not entirely. They leave behind echoes. And from now on, every 7th year, during Ghost Month, Ruolan would see the veil return, not to claim, but to warn. A flicker in the trees, a shadow across a mirror, a soft whisper in the dark. Remember the bride who said no. And in that remembering, there would be no more offerings, no more daughters stolen by tradition, no more names written in red. Only stories and silence and freedom. The village of Xiaoqu returned to silence, but it was not the same silence as before. This was not the hush of fear, not the stillness of unspoken rituals. This was the quiet that follows a long scream, the stillness after a storm that almost swallowed everything. A mourning silence, a freedom silence. No one spoke of what happened. There were no records, no temple bells rang, no priests wrote it down, but everyone remembered, even if they pretended not to. They remembered the bride who walked alone into the earth. They remembered how the fog retreated, how the drums stopped, how the shrine cracked like an egg that had been hiding something foul. They remembered the look in Ruolan's eyes when she returned, not broken, not haunted, but whole, like someone who had bled out a ghost and lived. She stayed in the village after that, not as a daughter, not as a bride, not even as a Liu, but as something else entirely, a reminder. She tended the altar, not with incense, but with truth. She replaced the ancestral tablets with blank wood. She painted over the mural with white clay. She burned the wedding contract, and with her own hands she disassembled the veil, thread by thread, then buried it deep beneath the roots of the magnolia tree, where the petals bloomed red for the first time in years. No longer blood, just color. The villagers adjusted slowly. At first, they tiptoed around her, afraid that the curse might return if they said the wrong name, the wrong prayer, the wrong thought. But over time, they began to knock on her door, to ask questions, to bring their daughters with eyes wide open. And she told them the truth, that fear wears tradition like silk, that silence becomes a god when no one speaks its name, that sometimes ghosts aren't spirits, they're stories told the wrong way. Some of the old families left. They couldn't bear to live in a place where the rules had changed. Others stayed, planted new rice, built new homes, taught their children that offerings don't need blood, that protection doesn't come from sacrifice. Ruolan grew older. Her hair grayed like smoke. Her hands grew calloused from mending what others forgot. But she never left Xiaoqu, and she never married. Some said she couldn't. Some said she already had. No one ever saw the veil again, not fully. But every ghost festival, on the 7th night, some still claimed to hear something on the wind, a rustling at the window, a shimmer of red behind the trees, and they'd whisper,
she's watching. Not to punish, not to claim, but to guard. Because even after the altar was broken, even after the pact was undone, the veil remembered. And Ruolan, she was its final keeper. Not a prisoner, not a bride, but the only one who had ever walked through the fire and come back wearing her own name. And so, in the heart of a fog-choked valley that once made brides vanish, there is now a girl buried in red, not in silk, not in blood, but in magnolia petals. Where something once died, now something grows.